Hello and welcome to the second part of this MOOC, the MOOC on language and emotion at work. As you may have seen by now, in part 1 of this MOOC, we discussed some basic facts about the relationship between language and emotion, as well as how emotion permeates the different levels of linguistic description. So far we've been concentrating on just the purely, let's say purely, between inverted commas, linguistic facts of emotion and language. In the first module, we saw a general introduction to both parts of the MOOC, and then, some talks about this relationship, general relationship between language and emotion. In the second module, we saw talks and interviews and explanations about grammar and emotion, in particular the relationship between syntax and emotion and the lexicon and emotion. In module 3, we dealt with the phonological level of linguistic description, so we talked about phonology, prosody and emotion. In module 4, about the pragmatics of emotion, so everything that has to do with speakers and hearers and interlocutors and intended meanings, etc., regarding, of course, emotions. And in module 5, it was an extension in a way of the of module 4, because it is also within the pragmatic component of language. We explored the relationship between humor, irony and emotion. Now, in this second part of the MOOC, we will explore some different things. We will see and discuss in module 6, which is the one I'm going to introduce right away. We will see how language, cognition and emotional intelligence interact, at least as far as we know. In module 7, we will discuss the relationship between gender, language and emotion. In module 8, we're going to touch on I think it's a very interesting aspect of emotion, which has to do with the teaching, learning of languages, not only foreign languages, but also your native language or second languages. And in module 9, we're going to concentrate on persuasion and emotion. This is a module that will be developed and will be carried out mainly by the people from the persuasion sub-project of Emofundet, who are experts and they specialize in the persuasive function of language and what its relationship to the expression of emotion or the triggering of emotions in the audience is. And we have some extra talk about emotions in big data, in present times, and it's important also to be able to detect emotion in computers. So now I will then give you the introduction to this first module of the second part of the MOOC, which is about language, cognition and emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence and linguistic competence at work. So in line with the work of other linguists and scholars, for example Fallen, who's a scholar you will see in 2 or 3 of the talks and interviews that we have included in this MOOC. The following are basic assumptions of our group, at Emofundet. Language, the first one is that language and cognition interact. And the second one is that it is very possible that there exists a relationship between the manner in which we express our stance and emotions through language and so-called emotional intelligence. Here we refer to the concept of emotional intelligence developed by Goleman in his writings of 95, 98, etc. So there is an assumption, or it is an assumption of cognitive linguistics, that the way human cognition works influences the structure of human language and vice versa. Cognition then is strongly connected to both language and emotion. And one of our main research questions in this research group has been the following. Is there any kind of correspondence between emotional intelligence competencies And language competencies? Do I show my emotional intelligence by the way I speak or by the strategies of communication, the discourse strategies that I use? We don't know yet, but there are some studies that are going in that direction, and in fact we are trying to find out more about it. You know, emotional intelligence and its consequent manifestation in language. Here what I want to explain is what we mean by emotional intelligence. We don't mean, of course we follow Goleman and the psychologists in their explanation, of course, although there are two different kinds according to psychologists of emotional intelligence, but mainly we don't mean that by being emotionally intelligent means that you let it all hang out, or that you just give loose rein to your emotions and you say whatever comes out to your head and you always express everything you feel. No, it has nothing to do with that. Rather, it means managing feelings so that they are expressed appropriately and effectively, enabling people to work together smoothly toward their communication goals. This is what Goleman says about what he means by emotional intelligence. And many other studies, such as McClelland in 1973, have shown how emotional intelligence counts more than IQ or even expertise for determining who excels at a job or who is more likely to become a leader. So there is a kind of relationship between being emotionally intelligent, being able to communicate emotionally intelligently, and being a leader. Goleman, in his emotional competence framework, speaks about two main kinds of emotional competence. First one is personal competence, which has to do with how we manage ourselves. And here he has three main aspects. Self-awareness, which means knowing one's internal states, preferences, resources, and intuitions. Self-regulation, which has to do with managing one's internal states, impulses, and resources. And motivation has to do with the emotional tendencies that guide or facilitate reaching goals. Now, the second one is social competence. And within social competence, we have two main points, important things. Empathy, which is the awareness of others' feelings, needs, and concerns, and social skills, the adeptness at inducing desirable responses in others. So these are the elements of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, motivation, empathy, social skills, self-regulation, personal and social competencies. Now, it is interesting to see that people who are not psychologists or linguists have studied how in work environment it is important to have an awareness of the difference between sensitive versus non-sensitive messages. And here I'm talking about Dulac and Fielding, who in their book entitled Principles of Business Communication, they explain that there are two main types of messages in business communication: sensitive messages and non-sensitive messages. By non-sensitive messages, they mean those which convey information that readers process and respond to intellectually, but not emotionally. Those would be the non-sensitive. So it has to do with the response more than what the speaker says or writes. And sensitive messages are those which elicit emotional reactions in readers. And it is the reader's probable reaction, not the writer's reaction to a message, that determines whether the message is sensitive or not. So, according to these authors, there are three main types of sensitive messages, because sensitive messages are the ones that interest us here. Positive sensitive messages, which are those evoking feelings of gladness and pleasure. Negative sensitive messages, which are those evoking feelings of dismay, anger, and disappointment. And persuasive sensitive messages, which are those attempting to cause the reader to take an action desired by the writer. The reaction may also be positive or negative. And here again we see the relationship between persuasion and emotion. And you're going to see this more in detail in Module 9. So, in general, we could say that sensitive messages will express and also trigger a positive, sensitive messages in general will express or trigger a positive or a negative stance. But non-sensitive messages, a neutral stance. Now, I wanted to show you, by means of some corpus examples, we've been working with email messages at the workplace. And in this case, it was email interaction among Spanish and English workers in an international engineering company. Of course, all the information has been kept anonymous, and we're going to analyze messages, but we will know who wrote them, etc., because of ethical reasons. So sensitive messages eliciting positive emotions, which show management of emotional competence and therefore emotional intelligence. Examples like the following. Here we have, these messages at first sight seem to be very aseptic because they are engineers, mainly writing in an engineering company. However, you will see that even within, this kind of environment, you can find lots of emotion, and you can analyze the discourse according to the emotional predisposition of the writer and also the receiver of the messages. So here we have an example of a speech act of request plus empathy, showing empathy, which is one of the competencies of emotional intelligence according to Goleman. So here we are trying to map linguistic strategies with emotional intelligence strategies, and see how they work together or how they interact. So by empathy we mean the consideration of the other party's thoughts, which shows social competencies. Empathy plus social skills according to Goleman's taxonomy. And of course these constitute an effective tactics for persuasion. So if you look at the message, he just says, Paul says, Juan, I think it would be worthwhile to organize another meeting early next week to discuss your thoughts. It would be helpful to have the items outlined above prior to this meeting. So as you can see, Paul doesn't say, just do this, directly. He's being indirect. He's requesting Juan to organize another meeting and also to have the items outlined prior to the meeting. But at the same time, he shows consideration and empathy for his interlocutors, in this case, thoughts, because he says, we would like, or it would be worthwhile to discuss your thoughts. And then, of course, he uses negative politeness. It would be helpful to have the items outlined, etc. So in an indirect way, he shows empathy, but at the same time, he gives, or he makes a request. So here we see that Paul can more or less manage the competencies of emotional intelligence. Also, here we have an example of a sensitive message showing social skills. Again, in this case, building bonds, nurturing instrumental relationships. This is how it would be classified by Goleman. So if you look at the message, Tony says, hello Dennis, Mr. A good customer of ours, contacted me recently to ask if we knew of any company in Singapore who might be interested to partner with them on the upcoming Line 7 work. Of all the companies we know, your company, Fosta, came to mind as perhaps being the likely candidate. To this end, I passed along your coordinates to Mr. A. I hope you don't mind. We do in parentheses with a question mark. They said, please do not feel any obligation on your part. And then he says, I'm just asking that you let Mr. A or myself know, etc. Thank you, best regards. So here you have many linguistic strategies that map onto the emotional intelligence strategies or competencies, such as the use of parenthetical comments. First, evaluating, as you see in A, he used a parenthetical comment to say, Mr. A, a good customer of ours. He's evaluating Mr. A as a good customer. And also showing a stance towards a colleague. And in B, when he says, I hope you don't mind, question mark, we see that he uses a parenthetical comment, a linguistic strategy, to show concern towards the addressee, showing that he hopes he doesn't mind, so he did it thinking he wouldn't mind, etc. And also we see here the use of negative politeness, which has to do with non-imposing redress, as we can see in C, because he says, please do not feel any obligation, I don't want to impose on you. That's what mainly negative politeness is about. And then also the use of softeners or minimizers, or what we call hedges in linguistics, such as just, when he says, I'm just asking that you let Mr. A or myself know. So, as you see, this speaker, this writer of this message, of this email message here, is combining linguistic strategies and linguistic competencies with emotional intelligence competencies, trying not to impose, not to be rude, etc. Now, as for this, the previous ones had to do with positive emotions. Here, now we're going to see one which not so positive emotion or reaction on the part of the interlocutor. Here we have a sensitive message possibly eliciting negative emotions, and which may thus show mismanagement of emotional intelligence. Here we have, this is, a very, very, I would say, cold message, because Daniel says, hi Oliver, night shift, compensation. She's just given data, information, but very, supposedly just objective information. But look at the word which is in bold there. Here Daniel says, checked with the packer almost all the terms involved. So that's why we are going to see now, because of that word, this message, from being apparently neutral, turned into a sensitive message because of the reaction of his interlocutor, of Oliver's reaction. If you see here, he uses red print, and what seemed to be a non-sensitive cold message then turned out to be very sensitive, because Oliver says, Daniel and all TSA, can you clarify what is meant by almost? And then in red print, it needs to be clear on this email which terms have been checked with the packer, which terms are completely clear, which etc., etc. Especially the terms that were checked are the ones to be used today in a concurrent routing proposal. So this became sensitive, very sensitive, and negatively so, because we see that the receiver, in this case, when he replies to the message, he uses red print together with certain expressions or constructions in order to express irritation at the lack of precision on the part of a Spanish member of the team. The expressions such as, can you clarify by, I don't understand what you mean by, etc., etc. So it is, a message that has turned out to be sensitive and in a very, not very, but in somehow negative way. Also, you can show impatience, irritation, and unpleasant surprise, show your emotions, by means of the repetition of questions asked before, which, according to Dulek and Fielding, this is one of the simple ways to make readers angry, because it may be taken as a real or imaginary implication that they are stupid, if you're repeating the question again and again. Then also, reference to a similar procedure or norm in the writer's own culture, this we're going to see in the next example, in order to contrast the apparent lack of it in the culture of addressee. So here, in a way, attacking cultures also, because as I said, this is international, but mainly Spanish-English, so they have the English and the Spanish exchanging emails. And the use of excessive question and admiration marks and question tags to show unpleasant surprise, as we will see here. You see? It says, attached is the Spanish standard copy that we use to get blah, blah, blah. And he says, as I asked before, so he's repeating the questions. Have you got the load, blah, blah, blah? If not, can you provide, etc. Then, repeated questions again. Does it mean that you can do it and this is the rate? And then, here we have exclamation marks showing surprise, and somehow not very pleasant surprise. And then, as I said, the comparison of the two cultures. This graph is something that you get while you're doing the test. It seems that it is not according to any British standards, or is it? So, again here we see how these linguistic strategies are combined with emotional intelligence strategies in order to show some kind of emotion, either positive or negative. So this was just a few. There was a few examples for you to see that there is a relationship between emotional intelligence, or that there seems to be some kind of relationship between how you say things and how you manage your emotions, and this management can have good or bad results at the workplace. So in this module we intend to explore the relationship between linguistic competence and the competence showing emotional intelligence. This is just the introduction, but what you're going to see has to do also with this topic, and we're going to have experts such as Juan Carlos Pérez González, who will talk about emotional intelligence as a personal characteristic that affects communicative competence. And as we've seen in the examples analyzed, some linguistic and pragmatic strategies may be associated to certain emotional competencies. And apart from Dr. Juan Carlos Pérez González, we will also have Dr. Joan Neff from the Complutense University, also a member of our group, who will teach us some interesting facts about the relationship between language, cognition, and emotional intelligence. She will explain to us how it is that not only humans, but also chimpanzees feel empathy, and how cooperative groups of animals in general, including humans, because we're animals, outperform those which are not cooperative. So this is the end of the introduction to Module 6. In all the presentations you have the bibliography, as you see. I wanted to show it to you today so that you know that the PowerPoint presentations are also available in the course, and so you can consult the bibliography whenever you want. So enjoy the rest of Module 6 and see you in the next module. Bye-bye.